All right, so I'll pick it up from here. Hello, I'm I'm Alex. For those who I haven't really talked to, I think I've talked to most of you. So hello. Can you see the presentation?
Yep.
All right. Let me open chat before we begin so I don't miss your messages. All right. So we will be talking about classes and objects this week. Don't worry, you're not supposed to know what those mean yet. So we will get to those on the next few slides. If they work. They work. Okay. So the goal of this lesson. So in this lesson, we will learn how to create classes, how to use classes, what access modifiers are, and how to create a constructor for our classes. So you're not really supposed to know what those words mean. As I said before, we'll get to those. Hopefully, I'm sure you'll know at the end. So let's get started. All right, so here are some key terms. We'll get to these, hopefully all of them, by the end of the lesson. So I've said this word called class many times. You're probably wondering what that means. Then there are words like object, instance, constructor, field, method, access modifier, all very fancy, I know. So what are classes? Can anyone tell me? Type in chat or unmute. What do you guys think is a class? Like when you hear the word class, what do you think of? Let's a room full of students. Yeah, I like that one. Oh, like a main class. Yeah. So we've seen something with the class word be in front of it before. So yeah, like the main class. Exactly, Bashar. A room full of students. Zamal says maybe we can put some data in it, move it to another place. Maybe that's something that we'll see. But yeah, when I think of the word class, like outside of programming, I also think of a room full of students, right? I think of this, right? Books, Zoom classes, all of these like fun things, right? But in programming, obviously, we're talking about something a little bit different. So what is a class in programming? It's like a blueprint or a template. Um, now, what does that mean? It means like we can make a bunch of like similar things that like share a lot of different things. So fancy words in like Java terms, you create your own objects with unique methods and fields. We only know what methods are, so like functions. So we know that like these classes, they can have their own functions and things. And we'll learn what the other two mean in a second. But do we know any example of classes? We've done a little bit of classes in the previous class. Do we know any like examples by chance? You can remember any. If not, that's fine. But please try to type it in chat or tell me. Yeah, so main is a very common one. That one's a little bit special because main is used to run other things in general. So another example would be moving on. Never mind. So we'll get back to that question. We'll get back to the examples part, but real quick. So what is an object? I've been saying this word a lot today, but what is an object? Well, in real life, objects are around us, right? They like I have my mouse, right? I have my computer screen. That's an object. My webcam is an object, right? These are all objects. But what do I mean like in Java? So kind of like um, things like how things in real life have different like characteristics and things. Like my mouse has a size, has a weight. It's pretty small. It's pretty light too. Or like my phone. They have like different attributes. They have like, yeah. And in Java, objects are things with attributes as well. And when we make a class or we define a class, it lets us like modify and like choose what we want those characteristics to be. So that can be a little confusing. So we'll just keep going forward and hopefully things will make more sense in a few slides. So yeah, let's get to the example. So one thing that we talk about a lot, or we talked about last week, is the string class, right? This is one that we've all used. You might not have known that it was like a class, but it is. And so let's talk about the string class, right? So what tells us that it is like a class, right? So we know we have like the data types int, boolean, double, right? Are those classes? Not really, but strings are. And how do we know that, right? So the string has a capital letter. So this is very important actually. When you see a capital S for string, or like when something is capitalized in the data type, it usually means it's referring to a class. So see how when we do integer, or we do not integer, int, or we do boolean, or we do double, or we do float, those are all lowercase, right? So that's one thing that tells us. And in this case, Java has created a bunch of functions and things for us. And then we can use the dot operator basically to like tell us things. So if we look at the snippet of code, we have a string example, right? And we can like use Java's functions for it. So if we want the length of example, we can do example dot length. So we use the dot operator, and we call this function length on it that Java wrote for us, basically. Or we can do example dot char at 0, which gives us the first character in the string. So things like that are like, they kind of show you what kind of a class looks like in Java. And you know what? We're going to teach you how to make some of these because they're actually really useful. So are there any questions so far? You feel free to type them in chat or ask your mentors or anything, or stop me. If not, I'm going to keep going. So sounds all good? All right. Thank you for the thumbs up, and thank you for the chat message. So, all right, a few more. So why are classes important? Why do we care? You're gonna see this like term thrown out a lot, like Java is primarily object-oriented programming. It's like a fancy word, like few words, I guess there's more than one word that people like to use. Is scanner considered a class? Yes, it is. So well, we'll talk about scanner. Well, we did talk about scanner, I think. But yeah, it is a class. It has like different functions like next int, right? And other functions that are written for you. So yeah, it's one of Java's pre-written classes. All right, back to the slide. So yeah, Java is an object-oriented programming language. It's basically built on the fact that you use classes a lot of the time because classes are very, very powerful. They're more useful than primitive data types, aren't they? So like when we do integer or int, when we make int x equals 5, we can't really do anything with it. We can't really do anything by itself, right? It stores one very small thing, and then there are no functions, like there's nothing special we can do it, right? But when we use the string class, or we use a wrapper, the integer wrapper class, or like a few other things that are like, built in, we can do like string.char at, string.length, that's a typo, I apologize. Things like integer.toString, you have like all of these special functions that are just so much easier for the user to use. So classes are very important. So how do we create one? So this is a very simple example. So can someone tell me what we are looking at? It's kind of an easy question, but one of you guys should tell me what I'm looking at. Yeah, some random points, right? So let's think about this. What makes up a point on a number lines, on a Cartesian plane specifically? What are like X and Y? Exactly. Correct, Ashar. Yep. YouTube Muhammad. Yep. So points store two pieces of data, right? They store an X position, a Y position, maybe something special depending on what you're doing, but mainly just an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, right? So basically, when this is like going back, so we talked about blueprints, right? So like, can I go back a slide? Oh, yeah. So I'm looking at our image, right? So we said a class is like a blueprint, right? So you see how we have multiple points. We have one at 2, 3. We have one at -3, 1. We have -1.5, -2.5. What if we wanted to make or store a bunch of different points, but it would be really annoying, right? You'd have like integer x1 for this point would be equal to 2, integer x or y1 would be equal to 3, and then you'd have another integer storing like this is 0.2. So you'd have like integer x2 equals -3, integer y2 equals 1. There are like 6 variables like for 3 points. That's so painful, right? And it's like not very organized. So that's kind of like where the blueprint, the class comes in, because we can make one data type for ourselves that stores an x and a y point kind of grouped together. So it's just easier to use and easier to read. Does that make sense? Okay. I see some nods in the chat, so, or through webcam. So let's get to the code then. If we want to have this functionality, what does it actually look like? Okay. It's kind of boring, right? Public class point, makes sense. It's a class. There's the word class. That makes sense to me. Generally, just another naming thing. The capital letter, so point is capitalized. That way, everyone that's reading your code knows that we're dealing with a class. And wow, this was very easy. There's an x coordinate and a y coordinate. That's very simple, right? This is nothing too hard, right? You guys got this. This is like nothing new. So at the very basic level, this is like what a class is. Now, how do we use it, right? So we can do something like this. So you can do point. So now that we've made it, you can use another file and you can go point my point equals a new point. It's obviously empty at the start. So you need to set the coordinates. My point dot x coordinate equals 3. My point dot y coordinate equals 4. And then you can use it. So you can pull out the pieces of data again once that you've put in. So you can do like I went forwards, backwards. So you can pull out the data, right? So if you want to know what the x coordinate of my point is, it'd be 3. And if you don't want to know what the y coordinate of my point is, it'd be 4 because you set them, right? So this is better than what we had before. This is better than 2 floating integers, but still not great, right? Like it's not bad, but you still have to like, set each individual thing. It's kind of annoying. So before we get to how to make it more interesting though, let's talk about some key terms or words. This way, like when people talk about these things, you know what's happening. So variables that are stored by the class are called fields or instance variables. They're both really fancy words. I'll talk about more what an instance means. So the second one will make more sense, but they're known as fields. It's very common. So yeah, they're unique and all of that. Basically, it's the last slide, what you saw. So yeah, these things here, they're called instance variables or fields. More fancy words. All right. So now the question is like, what if we weren't just storing a point? What if we were doing something that's had like 50 different instance variables? Or maybe not 50, but like a lot, right? So for example, what if a coordinate point stored more than that? What if, for example, we were on a map, right? And you would have an X and Y location for every building, but obviously a building is more than just an X and Y location. It has a name, has an address, it has all of these things. It has like 3, 4, maybe 5 different fields, different instance variables. This is very annoying then, right? Where I have to like go through and set each one individually. There has to be a better way to do this. So there's this thing, it's called a constructor. So funny enough, it's for constructing the thing, right? So that's a very good name. It's like a special built-in function. So as you can see, our point class has gotten 4 lines bigger. So there's this little extra snippet here. And the way you create a constructor is notice that very specifically, the name of the constructor function is the name of the class, right? So we use point, the name of the class is point, so our constructor is called point. And also notice that there is no like output argument. There is no return value. So that is another thing. So you're not returning an integer, you're not returning a Boolean, you're not returning anything. Those are the two things. And then it just looks like a normal function, right? So you have an input x and input y, because in this case, we want to set the x and the y. And then once we get two values of x and y, we set the x coordinate to the input x value and the y coordinate to the input y value. So the reason you see the this keyword too, I'm sure you guys haven't really seen this before, is that when you use this, it makes sure that the computer knows that you're referring to the one inside the class body, the instance variable here. So you actually don't have to use this in this specific case because the names are unambiguous, like they're different names. But sometimes people like to write their code such that it's int x coordinate, int y coordinate in the input, and then with if they name this input x coordinate the same thing as that, you would use this to differentiate them. All right. Where are we going from here? Okay, yeah. So more of the same, right? They use the same name as the class, which I just said, and they use input parameters. All right. Cool. So now, look, it's one line of code, not 3 lines now. That's so much nicer, right? So if you look before, we had to set the x coordinate and y coordinate individually. Now we don't. So now we do point my point equals new point 3, 4. And the reason we can just do that is because if you look at our constructor, it's 2 parameters int x and y, and it sets the x coordinate, sets the y coordinate. So when we create one over here, it does it very nicely for us. And we don't have to write any more code except this one line. And this will now work. So saves us 2 lines of code, is really easy, and makes nice constructors. So, all right, are there any questions up till this point? Because if you get this part, the next part will be pretty easy as well. So any questions from here? All right, I'm getting some thumbs up. So everyone seems okay. So let's keep going. All right, so let's give you guys an opportunity to try it yourself. Right, so, okay. Let's create a book class. Or actually, you guys are going to create a book class. So yeah, just boot up IntelliJ and give this a try. Actually, yeah, so just give it a try. I think someone will send the slides link in the chat, or I can grab it real quick. So you guys can have reference. So yeah, let me know if you need anything. This shouldn't be too bad. So yep, there's the presentation link in the chat, so you guys can look at the point class that we've been talking about and go and make a book class. So what time is it right now? It is 17. So I will give you guys how about this? I'll give you 10 minutes and we'll see where we fall after 10 minutes. So at 27, we will reconvene and talk about the solution. Yep. Make sure you type in the chat when you're finished so we know. So far, I've only seen 2 of them, so I'll give you guys a couple more minutes to keep working if you aren't quite finished yet. So if you are finished, feel free to take a break. Or if you would like to present the solution in a few minutes, that would also be very much appreciated. Just a clarification, instance, I haven't really talked about it yet, but it's basically like when you make a version of your book. So for example, when you do book, whatever the name of your book is equals new book. That is one instance of your class. All right. I'm still muted. We will be moving on. So I think Bashar was the first one that told me that they wanted to share their screen. So just in order of that, I will stop the share, and Bashar, if you would like to share, go for it. It's all yours.
Yes, for sure. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. At first, can you see my screen?
You're all good.
Okay. Here I started with creating a new Java class from source, new Java class, and I named it book as you wanted us to name it. Started with data fields, string name, the first data field, another string other of the book, name of the book, other of the book, and number of pages of the book. And here the first constructor, I meters, string n for the name, string a for the other, integer number for the numbers of pages, and this dot name equal n, this dot other equal a, this number of pages equal no, or number of pages. And another class for the main, here the main class, I created two instances, book 1 and book 2, new book. First is the name of the book, A is the author of the book, for example, The Truth by Ahmed or Ahmed, and 415 pages. Another, the same thing, and I printed all the results, just like this.
That looks great.
Just here, book 1, book name The Truth, books other the Ahmed, number of pages 415, book 2 the same thing. Everything is clear. Any questions? Anyone?
Yeah.
Stop my sharing now.
That looks great. Thank you very much for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Let me get my share screen up again. So that was a very good explanation. I also have a solution. No, I don't. I went backwards. Right here, it's like the same thing. Instead of number of pages, I did publishing date for some reason. Number of pages, honestly, probably a better one. So very good job. So yeah, it's basically the same thing. This is an example where you have to use this. So where are my settings? Ah, here they are. So for example, if you do the input as string name, which is the same as the instance variable, string author, which is the same here, you have to use this. In Bashar's example, he didn't have to use this. Obviously, this is always helpful, but he didn't have to. In this case, you have to because there's ambiguity, or there's like, it's not clear if you just did name equals name, which name is which name, which is very confusing, even me saying it, which is why there's this. So just clarifying that point. All right. So another very useful thing is that a class, besides just storing information, can do things like modify or like change things. So yeah, you can basically, last lesson where we learned how to make functions, you can do those in classes too. And already made functions as part of classes, just more as like a part of a main class and not as like an attribute or like another function of other things. So let's do that. A method. So actually, Bashar gave us a where he made separate print lines with a bunch of like work to basically print out the entire book, right? So this is a actually good example of one of the most common methods that we use, which is like creating a toString function. But in this case, we're going to use a print function. Cool. So for example, we could create a function called void print book, and we could just have it do something such as system.out.println name plus by plus author, and we can basically just do whatever the book is dot print book every time, like you would do it in a normal function using the dot operator, just like you would access the name, author, or publishing date, and you would get basically a much easier way of running print book all the time on all of your books without having to make separate print lines. So this is one example. There are many actually. I mean, the possibilities are kind of limitless, which is like what's so powerful about class is that you could have as many of these methods as you want. So when you have like, you can just do like a lot, basically what I'm trying to say. Yeah. So there are these more special functions that are that you'll commonly see. There are things called getters and setters. And we will talk about why they're called those in a second. But if you couldn't tell, they're used to get variables, they're used to set variables, and they mainly exist when this thing called private is used. So we don't quite know what that is yet, but let's talk about it. So actually, let's do another nice thing in the chat. What do you guys think private means? Or what is your definition / use case of private? Also, my chat has disappeared and I cannot find it, but you guys should type in there and I will find a way to see the chat, hopefully. Maybe. Also, let me know if you have any questions, of course.
Can you see them? Because I can read them out if you can't see.
I can't see it right now, but I like to be able to see it, so I might. Oh, I found it. Now the question is, does it go away when I share my screen? Okay, I got it. All right. Something that is not for everyone. I like that. Yep. Only for you. Yep. Something that no one has to know except who you want. Yeah. So that's basically what private also means in Java, right? So there are these things called access. This is going to be a very brief explanation because I don't really have a good example for you. But basically in Java, there are 3 main types of access. So when you don't, so for example, when we go back here, see how we don't specify public or private or anything in front of the variable names? Well, first of all, actually, let's talk about an even easier thing. So see how our book has public in front of it right here? That just means like public is like very simple. Basically, if your code is in the same source folder, you can like access it basically, right? So what this means is like what Bashar showed us. See how in his, remember, he used 2 different files. He made a book class, and then he also had another Java file called week 6, where he ended up making the instance of book, right? So this is an example of where public is super nice because everything can see it. Public innately is like all the Java files can see all the public ones. So funny enough, our variables over here we didn't specify anything. We didn't specify whether they're public or private or anything. So they default to a thing called package private or package public. Sorry, words. Package private. And basically that's a fancy word for if they're not in the same package, they cannot see each other. And a package, you'll learn eventually, is not super important right now, but basically if they're in the same folder, they're in like the very same folder. So that's why package private things work. And then there's private, which is only things inside this class can see it and use it. So for example, if I were to make string name private right here, you could not do book.name and get a value. It would not exist. So now you might ask, why do we make anything private then? If it's just more work, or like if I can't see it, right? So part of the reason you want to make things private is because there's this generally, this is like more of like a corporate, or like when you're writing code with like a million files, it becomes very messy, and sometimes they're like overlapping names of things, and oftentimes they're also attributes that you don't want to be touched, so you make things private is kind of the general rationale for it. So yeah, this is why you need getters and setters, is when you're required to make things private. So you make getters and setters in order to still modify and still be able to access them, but without like touching the internal value, or without messing with the internal value, basically. So what do getters and setters look like? Well, they're pretty boring, in full honesty. So yeah, so basically when you getters look like get x coordinate, get y coordinate, that you just return the x coordinate value. Very boring. You get the value of x coordinate. When you set them, well, you take an input value and then you set your x coordinate to the new x coordinate. So yeah, they're actually like really boring and really basic, but they're very helpful. So Zama, what do you mean by scarful? I don't know that word. Scary? I agree, it's kind of annoying. Not quite sure what you mean on that one, but all right. So this is the next exercise. Basically, it's just you're gonna make all the variables in book private. You're gonna add another parameter, which is age. You're gonna create a function that just increases the age of the book by 1. It's kind of boring, I'm sorry. That's a good exercise. And you're gonna make getters and setters as well. And you're gonna use one of your getters to make the name, to get the name of one of the instances of books. And you should also do is you should adjust your previous code such that it works with the getters and setters now too. So this is a pretty long exercise. There are a lot of things that you have to do. So don't be afraid to like take it slow. I'll give you until, we'll check in again in 17 minutes. So at the new hour. Yeah, I'll check in there. Make sure everything's going well. This is like the main, like, there's not very much else after this. So if you guys get this all nice and done, you will be very you'll be in a very good place for this lesson. So happy coding. All right, it is 12:05 over here, or 7:05 over there. So it might be a good idea to talk about this question because it's pretty tough. So, all right, let's see if I can help you guys through this. So I hope you guys all were able to get the first step. So make all the variables private. What does that look like? I'm missing a semicolon, don't question that. But yeah, so we add private in front of these 4 integers. Sorry for not explicitly like putting it on a slide, my bad. Now that I think about it, but this is what it looks like. So here are the 4 I'm okay. Never mind that. So yeah, so this is what it looks like to do the first step. Private, 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 private. Okay. Everyone good with that? My chat has disappeared again. Okay. No one is saying anything, so I'm going to assume that we get that part. Add an age parameter for your book. This probably should have said instance variable. I am griefing. I am have my bad. Apologies. Genuinely. So, but what that looks like, private integer age, please put a semicolon after your variables. Don't be like me. So yeah, that's that part right there. Add a method to increase the age of the book. Okay. All right. So, the way I did it, or the way I thought about it, was, I would just create in a function, right? It's public, it's void. It's just called increase age. And when you do your book name dot increase age, you just make age one bigger, right? So you just increase the size of age. So you just do age plus plus. Then the next part, getters and setters. So this is a pretty important part of the exercise. There are 4 variables. So you should have, yep, as Ramesa said, age plus plus is the same as age equals age plus 1. Yeah, it's just shorthand. So if we see 4 variables, that means a total of 4 getters and 4 setters. So we have get name, you just return the name. You have set name, so it's void, and you set the name, and then the same thing for each of the other variables, all the way down to set age. I can't go back. All right. And okay, I did not show this step, but the code that this would look like is, I'll just type it in the chat so that you guys can see it. It's easier than me saying things. But say you made a book. I don't exactly have a good example of a book. Let's go Dr. Seuss. He's a cool guy. So we make a new book. This will be coming in chat in a few seconds. So sit tight. Okay, so using my constructor of that I created, that we have right here, let's say we make this new Dr. Seuss book, like how we do in chat, right? So how do we, I meant to go back. How do we get the name for one of our instances of the book, right? So remember how when our variables are not private, when they're public or package private by default, we can just do Dr. Seuss dot name. Something like this. Don't make typos, but in the chat, a way that you could just get the name of the book is to do string equals Dr. Seuss dot name, right? But now that it's private, we actually can't do that. So we have to use our getter specifically. So instead of that, we would have to do something like this. I'm typing. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Please ask. This is very confusing and it's a pretty difficult topic, so do not be afraid. No, this is not the console. This is imagining me in another Java class, right? So imagine like this is just me making the book and then trying to get the authors or trying to get the name of the book, not actually the author name, but just trying to get the name of the book. Does that make sense?
I think Walid is asking, correct me if I'm wrong, Walid, if you
Oh,
print
I see.
author, is that what you're asking? If you print
Okay.
author, what will you get? It will be the same
Oh, okay.
as,
I
yeah,
misinterpreted.
you can answer that question.
Yeah, I misinterpreted. Sorry, Wade. Yeah. So the name is Cat in the Hat, right? So if you were to print author name, you would get nothing, right? Because it's private. But if you printed author, because it was valid, it would print Cat in the Hat specifically. Does that make sense? So if you were to do this, I'm just gonna type in the chat so you guys can see what the code looks like, because I think that's easier to visualize than just not having it, I guess.
Is it possible by any chance to share your IntelliJ?
Yes, that's actually a good solution as well. All right, let me pull it up then. I don't have it open at the moment, but that is actually a very good suggestion. Thank you. Okay, we can spend a lot of time here because we're really ahead of schedule and this is really confusing and really tough to understand. So I'm happy to spend plenty of time here. So. All right, let's get this going. All right, let me see if I can increase the font size so you guys can see it a little better. Is it here? Does that work? No, it doesn't work.
By the way, if anyone is interested on how they can make their IntelliJ look really cool, feel free to come by, ask your mentor at any time, and they'll be happy to help you with that.
Oh, that didn't work either. Oh no. That's not fun. Oh, is that my console?
Do you have a mouse pad by any chance? Can you zoom in with your fingers?
I cannot.
Okay.
Sadly. Oh, there it is. This one? That one. Nice. Okay, this might be too big, but I think it's too big now. Oh no. Can't see a full line. Do something slightly more reasonable. Maybe like 30. Okay. This seems more reasonable. All right. So let's talk about this. Okay. So we have our book class. We are all familiar with this. Everything is private, right? So also, just a note on the project structure, I have everything in one folder. You don't need to see it. There's like a million files in here, but whatever. So they're all in the same file, right? So this is private. Everything is private, right? So let's test it out. Oh, it's not happy. Expected for okay. So this is an example of our book. Oh, let me check chat. I don't know if I can respond to anything in chat right now, so we'll talk about that in a second. Let's go through this real quick. So, all right, we'll say this is like 5 years old. That's not accurate. But okay, so this is just a random book. It's not very important. Why are there so many Zoom things in the way? Give me a second. Okay. Right. So let's play with this. So these are all private, right? So when I do something like this, when I do something like, say, let's try to print this, right? So if this were public, this would work, right? But see how it's giving me red? This doesn't exist, right? Or it has private access, right? So this is what it means when we talk about private access is I literally cannot get this variable if I wanted to. But if I make this, if I say delete this private from here. So if this is name is no longer private, it is fine to do this, right? So very important distinction here is putting private in front of a variable or not affects a lot of things, right? It affects whether or not I can get the variable from outside. So let's make this private again. So if we can't get the name of the book because it's private, how do we get it? We use our getter, right? So we have this function right here called getName that we made. So this is very helpful because we can just call this. So we can do never let me go dot getName, and that will work. All right. Are there any other questions about this specifically, this topic? Because I don't have too much more to say about it, but I'm very happy to answer questions. Is everyone kind of getting this? Yes, no, maybe so. I definitely didn't get it the first time I tried it, but that's okay. Should keep trying. It'll be fine. Also, okay, this is a good example. Let me show you how to use a setter. So you see how in the constructor we have set the age to 5. We can also change that, right? So if this were public, what we could do is we could do never let me go dot age equals like 10. So if obviously if age were public, then I could set its value by instead just using the dot operator and the variable, but we decided to make everything private, right? So in making everything private, we now can't do that. But what we can do instead is we can use our set age function and then give it a value, and that will set its value. And then when we do get age, it should print us out 10. Yep. So it did actually set the value. So our set age functions correctly. Okay. So are there any more questions about any of this? I'm going to move back to the presentation now. That was actually, I think, the last slide of content. So please let me know if you have any questions about any of that. It can be quite confusing. So now we are back here to our presentation. And from here, oh, okay. Key terms. These are always helpful. So, All right, let's take a few minutes to like define these words in our own terms. This is something you guys do every week. Gets kind of boring, but that's okay. So let's take a couple minutes. You don't have to like, I mean, I'd like you guys to like write down the definitions, but you don't have to. Just think about them. Please note down any of them that you do not understand, because these are big fancy words that are actually really confusing. So please take your time with this and make sure you fully get all of these, because they are very important, not just now, but in the future, if you'll continue to program. So yeah, I think I'll give you guys 5 minutes so we can reconvene at 26 to do that. I think would be fair. So give you guys 5 minutes. All right, it is 27. So let's go over these. Once again, this is for you guys. So any questions, just go for it. So yeah, these are my definitions, by the way. They're not picture perfect, but they're not bad. So a template, so a class is, I just like to think of it like a template as a blueprint. You can make multiple things of the same type. It's basically like defining a type. So an object, it's like, basically it's a class, pretty boring. What's an instance? It's kind of like one specific version of the class. So when I think of instance, I think of like the Dr. Seuss book, not book itself, but the Dr. Seuss specific book that we made. That is one instance of the book class, things like that. Or like when we make a specific point, we make P1, which is 2, 3, that is one specific instance of the point class. So that's what I think of as like one specific one. Constructor, I just think of it as a special function. It's the thing that makes my life easier when I go to make a class. So yeah. Field, that's just a variable belonging to a class. A method, it's just a function belonging to a class, or technically it's just a function, but in this context, it would be a function belonging to a class. And for access modifier, that's just some special keywords that modify where the data can be accessed from. So yeah, and when I think of those, I think of the words private or public. So yeah, are there any questions about any of those key terms? I do not see any. So what did we learn today? Hopefully how to create classes, how to use classes, what are access modifiers, and how to create a constructor. Also a few other things like getters and setters, but that goes along with that. So there's a lot in this lesson. So if you don't understand everything right away, I mean, it's really hard to. It's a pretty confusing lesson as well. So hopefully as you guys practice with the homework and go to office hours and meet with your mentors, everything becomes a lot easier. Sorry. So yeah. And everyone's favorite, it's homework. So I actually briefly want to touch on this because I at least think that it is pretty important, especially because it's not the simplest this week. So these are the 2 mandatory problems. They're actually quite challenging themselves, but that's okay. The reason they are so challenging is because you will use them in the final project, or so getting them done here for this homework means less work in the future, which is good. So yeah, you'll be making 2 classes. The first one is a player class. It's pretty basic. It stores an X and Y coordinate, a width and a height. So just in most, so as a kind of reference point, the final project is a 2-dimensional video game that you guys will all be making. And the player is a rectangle. And so if that helps, therefore he is an XY coordinate and a width and a height, right? Each player also stores their own score, so that's another variable. They also store a velocity in the Y direction. So that's just an integer. Don't think too much about that yet, but it's just an integer. Create a constructor. I'm sure you guys can do that. Create getters and setters. Yes, velocity is the same as speed. That is correct. That helps. And you should create a public method that increments the score of the player. So like, basically when you call the function, it just increases the score by 1. So this one is pretty straightforward. It's very similar to the one we did in class. So feel free to use our book class that we wrote in that is on the slides to help you. The platform class is also very similar, but a little bit more challenging, for sure. This one you might need more help with, but it also stores an X and a Y coordinate with a default value 0, 0. So I can show you guys how to use the default value. It's actually pretty straightforward. I'll show you guys that one in a second because it wasn't in the slides. Same thing, width and a height with the default value. That's pretty boring. Do not make a constructor, keep everything public. And here's the fun part. This is a pretty big challenge, but the reason I kind of want you guys to do the challenge is because it's a pretty big part of the actual game is doing collision detection. The math is actually pretty straightforward, but it's a little confusing. So kind of taking you through this is basically you're going to create a function in the platform class that basically takes in a player and determines whether or not the player and the platform are colliding or overlapping. So if you can see here in the first top left image, there are 2 rectangles that aren't really touching each other, but in the right image there are. So I'm going to briefly go over the algorithm, but it's a little confusing. So the easiest way to do this is, you don't really have to remember this, but it's basically to find the distance in the X. Well, first of all, let's talk. So basically, as you can see here, is that when the 2 blocks overlap in one direction, you can calculate that. And when they overlap in both the X and the Y direction, they actually overlap. But see here, when they only overlap in one dimension, they do not actually touch each other. Or if they don't overlap at all, obviously they don't touch each other either. So basically the way you calculate this overlap is you find the distance between the 2 blocks, like position-wise, and then you use the widths or the heights between them. So you know that the maximum distance between these two is basically like if the 2 widths are if we're doing coordinates in the center, so half the width of the first block and half the width of the second block added together, if the distance between the 2 blocks in that dimension is less than that less than the width of half the width of the first block plus half the width of the second block, they will touch each other. That's really confusing, and I will update this document with a much better explanation, like in depth. But that's the basic idea behind it. This is like by far the hardest part of this homework. So yeah, so sure, I can derive the equation now that will help you. So here, let me actually drop into MS Paint.
So to repeat again, well, for this video game that you all will build, there will be two objects, and when they collide, meaning they will crash into each other. So what we are trying to do is figure out the math for when they will crash into each other. And Alex will explain that now.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
So obviously this is confusing. I didn't understand it my first go around, so I will write it down for you guys. At the end of the day, it will basically just be an equation. So I will write it down, but here's the idea behind it. So say we have two rectangles. And let's say their x is in the center. So this is their x and this is y. This is x, this is y. Okay, basically their x and the y are in the center is what I'm trying to say. There's definitely a better way to do this, and Paint kind of hates me always. So let's call x and y in the center. And let's call like this distance width divided by 2, and this distance height divided by 2. And let's call this one the player. So this one's player height divided by 2 is this kind of length, and this kind of length is player width divided by 2. And okay, so basically, you're trying to find the overlap between the two rectangles in one direction first. So let's say it's in this x direction here. Basically, you want to see if the two blocks are overlapping, and the way you do that is you find the distance between the two in this direction. So this is like the x differential. So let's say this was at, let's say this was at 1 comma, actually that's probably not a good idea. Basically this distance d here, if this distance is greater than player width divided by 2 added with width divided by 2. So in this case, the distance is greater than that, then these are not touching in this direction. And if it is less than these two overlap, and if it is less than these two touching each other, or sorry, if it's less than the distance of the sum of the two widths, then they're touching each other. For example, if we do this, so now these two are definitely colliding, right? They collide in this spot right here, right? So this is what happens when this sum and this sum are less than the actual like total distance between the two. So that's how you find the overlap in one direction, and you need to do that in both directions. So you need to do that in the x and the y. And if they're overlapping in both the x direction and the y direction, then they are overlapping or they're touching each other, right? So I will leave you guys with an equation that you guys can use, or basically a better explanation in the homework. But this is the kind of idea behind what you're doing. If you have any questions now, feel free to ask them. But I'll leave you with a much more detailed explanation.